The excavator blade scraped against concrete where there should have been only dirt and tree roots. Mike Torino had been operating heavy machinery for 15 years, and he knew the sound of steel hitting something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something buried deep beneath what was about to become Millfield's newest strip mall. What he'd found was a tomb. March 15, 2024. 3 feet below the surface of an Ohio field that had been empty farmland for decades, construction workers discovered a reinforced concrete chamber sealed with a steel door that had been welded shut from the outside. 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and inside, for skeletons arranged in a neat row against the far wall. The skeletons belonged to teenagers who had vanished without a trace in September 1990. Sarah Martinez, 16. David Park, 15. Michael Torres, 17. Jessica Bloom, 14. 4 foster children who had disappeared from Meadowbrook Group Home on the same night, never to be seen again. For 34 years, their case files listed them as runaways. Troubled kids who'd fled into the night, probably heading for bigger cities where anonymous teenagers could disappear forever. The investigation was perfunctory. The case went cold within weeks. Within 6 months, Meadowbrook Group Home closed due to funding issues, and the children were forgotten by everyone except their biological families. People who had no power, no voice, and no resources to demand answers. But those children never ran anywhere at all. If you're into cinematic true crime stories based on real-life disappearances and cold cases finally cracked, subscribe now for weekly investigations that will keep you awake at night. Hidden alongside the remains, investigators found something that would crack open one of the most systematic child trafficking operations in American history. The meticulous files of a social worker named Margaret Shun, who had spent 11 days at Meadowbrook in 1990 documenting evidence of horrors that reached into the highest levels of Ohio's child welfare system. Margaret Shun had tried to save these children. Instead, she died with them, but not before hiding the evidence that would finally bring their killers to justice 34 years later. This is the story of 4 teenagers who refused to be victims, of a social worker who died trying to protect them, and of a conspiracy so vast that it took 3 decades to fully uncover. It's a story about children who deserved better, and about the courage it takes to stand up to monsters, even when you know it might cost you everything. What Mike Torino's excavator uncovered that March morning wasn't just a crime scene. It was proof that sometimes, the most important cases are the ones that refuse to stay buried. September 12, 1990. Location, Meadowbrook Group Home, Millfield, Ohio. The morning Margaret Shun arrived for her first day as a caseworker at Meadowbrook, she noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a well-run facility, but the thick, oppressive silence of fear. 12 teenagers lived in the converted farmhouse, but as she walked the halls that Tuesday morning, she could hear only the creaking of old floorboards and the distant hum of a television turned low. "They're good kids," said Eleanor Voss, the facility director, as she led Margaret through the main living area. "Quiet. Respectful. We don't have the behavioral problems you see at other homes." Margaret had worked in child services for 8 years. She knew troubled teenagers, and she knew what good kids looked like in this system. These weren't good kids. These were scared kids. The difference was important, and it was something Eleanor Voss either didn't understand or chose to ignore. The 4 she was meant to focus on were housed in the basement level, which Voss called the quiet wing. Sarah Martinez, 16, had been in care since age 11. David Park, 15, a Korean adoptee whose placement had failed. Michael Torres, 17, aging out in less than a year. And Jessica Bloom, only 14, the newest arrival, who'd been moved from 3 different homes in 6 months. "They keep to themselves down there," Voss explained, her key ring jangling as they descended the narrow wooden stairs. "Prefer their privacy." The basement was divided into 4 small rooms, each containing a single bed, a small dresser, and nothing else. No decorations, no personal items, no signs that anyone actually lived there. Margaret had visited dozens of group homes, and she'd never seen anything so sterile. "Where do they study? Do their homework?" "There's a common area," Voss gestured vaguely. "They're very independent." Margaret found Sarah Martinez in the facility's kitchen, methodically washing dishes that were already clean. The girl looked up when Margaret introduced herself, and for just a moment, something flickered in her dark eyes. Hope, maybe, or desperation. Then it was gone. I'm fine, Sarah said before Margaret could ask how she was doing. We're all fine here. The way she emphasized all made Margaret's skin crawl. That first week, Margaret tried to schedule individual meetings with each of the 4 teens. Sarah never showed up. David claimed he was sick. Michael said he was busy with chores. Only Jessica appeared, and she sat in the cramped office space Margaret had been given, staring at her hands and saying nothing for the entire 30-minute session. It was Jessica's silence that kept Margaret awake at night. Not defiance or anger, though she could work with. This was something else. This was the silence of someone who had learned that speaking was dangerous. September 19th, 1990. Location, Meadowbrook Group Home. Margaret arrived early that Thursday, before the official start of her day. She wanted to observe the morning routine, see how the children interacted when they thought no adults were watching. What she saw instead was Eleanor Voss's car already in the parking area, along with 2 others she didn't recognize. Through the kitchen window, she could see figures moving in the basement windows, adults, not children. The basement windows were small and set high in the foundation, but from her angle, Margaret could make out at least 3 people down there who definitely weren't teenagers. She waited in her car until 8 a.m., then walked in as if everything was normal. Voss greeted her with her usual thin smile, but there was something different in her manner, a tension, an alertness that hadn't been there before. The basement children are having a special therapy session today, Voss announced. Dr. Carmichael is working with them on some intensive trauma counseling. Very delicate work. We won't want to disturb them. Margaret had never heard of Dr. Carmichael. She made a note to look him up. The morning passed unusually. The other children, the ones housed on the main floor, seemed agitated, whispering among themselves and casting nervous glances toward the basement door. When Margaret tried to approach some of them, they scattered like startled birds. At lunchtime, she noticed that only 8 place settings were arranged in the dining room. Where are Sarah, David, Michael, and Jessica? She asked Voss. Still in session. Intensive work often runs long. They'll eat later. But Margaret had been watching the parking area. The 2 unfamiliar cars hadn't moved all morning. Dr. Carmichael's session was entering its 7th hour. She waited until Voss was occupied with a phone call, then slipped down the basement stairs. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet. She approached Sarah's room first. The door was closed but not locked. Inside, the bed was made with military precision, but Sarah's few belongings were gone. The small dresser was completely empty. David's room, the same. Michael's room, identical. Jessica's room looked as if no one had ever lived there at all. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, her mind racing. When she found Voss in the main office, she kept her voice carefully neutral. I need to speak with the 4 children in my caseload today. It's required for my weekly report. Voss didn't look up from her paperwork. I told you, they're in intensive therapy. Dr. Carmichael specifically requested no interruptions. Then I need Dr. Carmichael's contact information for my files. For the first time, Voss met her eyes. I'll get that to you tomorrow. Margaret left the building at her usual time, but she didn't go home. Instead, she parked 2 blocks away and walked back, positioning herself where she could see the facility's main entrance and parking area. She waited as the sun set, watching. At 9:47 p.m., the 2 unfamiliar cars finally left. They drove slowly, carefully, like people who had something heavy in their vehicles that they didn't want to jostle. Margaret waited another hour, then approached the building. All the lights were off except for a single lamp in Voss's office window. She tried the main door, locked. But she remembered seeing a basement entrance on the building's east side, an old storm cellar door that had been painted over but might still open. It did. The basement was completely dark. Margaret used the small flashlight from her keychain to navigate the narrow hallway. The 4 rooms were empty now, not just of people, but of everything. The beds had been stripped. The mattresses were gone. Even the small dressers had been removed. But in Jessica's room, Margaret's flashlight beam caught something in the corner. A small piece of paper, folded tight and wedged behind where the dresser had been. She unfolded it carefully. In a child's handwriting, barely legible in the dim light. Help us. They take us at night. Room under the barn. Please don't let them. The note ended there, as if Jessica had been interrupted while writing it. Margaret looked up from the paper and realized she could hear something. A low, mechanical humming coming from somewhere beneath her feet. She followed the sound to the far end of the basement, where she found a door she hadn't noticed before, painted the same color as the walls and fitted flush with no visible handle. She pressed her ear to the door. The humming was louder here, and underneath it, she could hear something else, something that made her blood freeze. Voices, adult voices, speaking in the measured tones of people conducting business. And underneath those voices, so faint she might have imagined it, crying. Margaret backed away from the door and ran. March 15, 2024. Location: former Meadowbrook property, Millfield, Ohio. Detective Ray Kowalski had seen a lot of things in 23 years of police work, but he'd never seen a crime scene that had been literally buried for 3 decades. The underground chamber Mike Torino's excavator had uncovered was a time capsule of horrors, preserved in concrete and steel like some nightmarish archaeological find. The forensics team worked carefully, documenting everything before removing it. For skeletons, arranged side by side against the far wall. Tattered clothing that matched descriptions from missing persons reports filed in September 1990. Personal items: a small silver necklace, a worn paperback book, a pair of glasses with one cracked lens. But it was the files that made Ray's hands shake as he photographed them. Someone had sealed dozens of manila folders in plastic bags before hiding them in the chamber. The bags had kept moisture out for over 3 decades, preserving documents that read like a catalog of systematic child abuse. Intake forms, medical records, psychological evaluations, all bearing the letterhead of Meadowbrook Group Home and signed by Eleanor Voss. And threaded throughout the official documents were handwritten notes in careful, precise script. Observations, dates, names. A social worker's private investigation into what was happening to the children in her care. The notes were signed M. Sean. Ray radioed for additional units and called his captain. This wasn't just a murder case. This was something much bigger. The documents suggested a network of abuse that had involved multiple adults, multiple locations, and possibly dozens of victims over several years. But first, he needed to find out what had happened to Margaret Chun. March 16, 2024. Location: Columbus Police Department. The search for Margaret Chun's whereabouts began with employment records. According to the Ohio Department of Human Services, she had worked at Meadowbrook Group Home from September 12 to September 23, 1990, exactly 11 days. Her termination was listed as voluntary resignation, but there was no forwarding address, no reference to other employment, no indication of where she'd gone. Detective Kowalski's partner, Lisa Zhang, ran Margaret's name through every database they had access to. Social Security records showed no activity after October 1990. No tax returns filed. No employment history. No medical records. No death certificate. Margaret Chun had effectively disappeared just 2 weeks after the 4 foster children vanished. Either she's dead, Zhang said, staring at her computer screen, or she's been living completely off the grid for 34 years. The files Margaret had hidden told a story that grew darker with each document Ray examined. Her notes revealed a systematic pattern of abuse that went far beyond what anyone had suspected. Children were being loaned out to adults from outside the facility. Medical records showed injuries consistent with severe physical and sexual abuse, but the explanations were always the same: behavioral incident, fall downstairs, altercation with peer. Most disturbing were Margaret's observations about the basement rooms and what she called the night visits. Her notes described a network of men who came to the facility after hours, adults who paid Eleanor Voss for access to the children in her care. The 4 teenagers who had disappeared, Sarah, David, Michael, and Jessica, had been singled out because they were what Margaret termed throwaways, kids with no family connections, no one to ask questions if they disappeared. But Margaret had been asking questions. And according to her final entry, dated September 22, 1990, she'd found something that proved the conspiracy reached much higher than just Eleanor Voss. Discovered V has been filing false reports with state oversight for at least 2 years, the note read. Children listed as transferred or aged out were never transferred anywhere. Estimate at least 12 missing over 24-month period. Found connection to Dr. Raymond Carmichael, not licensed therapist as claimed, but registered as buyer through private adoption agency. Agency connected to Judge Patricia Holloway, who signs off on all custody transfers in county. This goes all the way up. The final line was underlined 3 times. They know I know. Getting evidence to FBI tomorrow. She never made it to the FBI. March 18, 2024. Location, Ohio State Archives, Columbus. Ray spent 2 days digging through archived records, looking for any trace of the people Margaret Chun had identified in her notes. What he found painted a picture of corruption that had infected multiple levels of Ohio's child welfare system in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Dr. Raymond Carmichael had never been licensed as a therapist in Ohio, but he had been connected to something called Bright Futures Adoption Services, a private agency that had handled hundreds of hard-to-place children between 1987 and 1991. The agency's records showed an unusually high number of international adoptions, particularly children sent to buyers in countries with lax oversight of child welfare. Judge Patricia Holloway had indeed overseen custody decisions in Millfield County during that period. Her signature appeared on dozens of transfer orders for children who, according to Margaret's research, had never actually been transferred to new homes. After 1991, Holloway had moved to Florida, where she died in 2003. Eleanor Voss had disappeared entirely after Meadowbrook closed in February 1991. Like Margaret Chun, she'd simply vanished from all official records. But it was the financial records that provided the clearest picture of what had been happening. Bright Futures Adoption Services had processed over $2.3 million in placement fees during its 4 years of operation. The money had flowed through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, but Ray's forensic accountant was able to trace significant payments to Eleanor Voss, Judge Patricia Holloway, and at least 6 other people connected to the child welfare system. They'd been selling children, not just placing them for adoption, selling them to buyers who wanted no oversight, no questions, no official records of where the children ended up. And when some children proved difficult to place, teenagers like Sarah, David, Michael, and Jessica, who were too old, too damaged, or too likely to report abuse, they'd been eliminated entirely. March 20th, 2024. Location, FBI Field Office, Cleveland. The Margaret Chun files had revealed something bigger than a local corruption case. FBI Special Agent Karen Torres reviewed the evidence Ray had compiled and immediately opened a federal investigation into what she classified as a multi-state child trafficking operation. This is organized, Torres told Ray as they spread Margaret's documents across a conference table. Look at the dates, the systematic record-keeping, the financial structure. This wasn't some local group home director taking advantage of kids. This was a business. The FBI's initial investigation revealed connections between Bright Futures Adoption Services and similar operations in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Children who disappeared from group homes and foster care in one state would sometimes surface briefly in records from another state, then disappear again. But it was Torres who made the connection that broke the case wide open. Look at this, she said, pointing to a notation in Margaret's handwriting. V. mentioned the farm multiple times during phone calls. Thinks I don't hear her, but office walls are thin. Something about preparing the new space and expanding capacity. Asked about construction permits for rural properties in October. Torres pulled up a database of construction permits filed in rural Ohio counties between 1989 and 1991. There were dozens of entries, but one caught her attention. A permit for agricultural storage facility construction filed in October 1990 for a property in rural Millfield County. The permit had been filed under the name of a company called Meadowbrook Holdings. The property was less than 2 miles from where the children's bodies had been found. March 22, 2024. Location, rural property, Millfield County. The second excavation revealed the full scope of what had been happening at Meadowbrook. Ground-penetrating radar identified at least 3 more underground chambers on the property, each constructed with the same reinforced concrete and steel doors as the first. 2 of the chambers contained evidence of long-term habitation, mattresses, chains bolted to walls, and stacks of videotapes that the FBI's tech team was afraid to play. The third chamber was empty, but forensic analysis of the concrete floor revealed traces of bleach and other cleaning chemicals, suggesting it had been used for purposes no one wanted to speculate about. But it was what they found in the farmhouse basement that finally answered the question of what had happened to Margaret Chun. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators discovered a small room that had been set up as a makeshift office. File cabinets lined the walls, filled with documents that Margaret had stolen from Meadowbrook during her final days there. Intake forms for children who had never been reported missing. Financial records showing payments from Bright Futures Adoption Services. Correspondence between Eleanor Voss and her buyers, discussing the merchandise in terms that made Ray's stomach turn. And in the center of the room, Margaret Chin's body sat in a wooden chair, her hands still resting on an old manual typewriter. The final page in the typewriter read, "If you're reading this, then they found me before I could get this evidence to the FBI. Eleanor Voss and her people are running a child trafficking operation that reaches into the highest levels of Ohio's child welfare system. The 4 children who disappeared from Meadowbrook, Sarah Martinez, David Park, Michael Torres, and Jessica Bloom, were murdered because they tried to resist. They knew they were being sold, and they tried to fight back. I've documented everything I could find, but I know there are more victims. Children who were sold and shipped out of state or out of the country. Children who were killed when they became too troublesome. The underground chambers on this property were built to hold children until buyers could be found, or until Eleanor decided they were too much of a liability to keep alive. I tried to save them. I tried to get them out. But I was too late, and now I'm trapped here too. Eleanor's people found out what I was doing. They're coming for me, and I know I won't make it out of here alive. Please don't let these children be forgotten. Please make sure their families know what happened to them. And please find the others, because I know there are others." The note was dated September 25, 1990. Margaret Chun had been dead for 33 years, 7 months, and 28 days. March 25, 2024. Location, Columbus Police Department. The Margaret Chun files had led to the biggest child trafficking investigation in Ohio's history. FBI agents working around the clock had identified at least 47 children who had disappeared from group homes and foster care facilities across 4 states between 1987 and 1994. Most had never been reported missing. Their disappearances covered up by falsified transfer documents and bureaucratic sleight of hand. Eleanor Voss remained missing, but federal agents had traced her to a compound in rural Guatemala, where she'd been living under an assumed name since 1991. Extradition proceedings were underway, though Voss's lawyers were fighting the charges. Dr. Raymond Carmichael had been found living in Costa Rica, where he'd continued operating what authorities suspected was another child trafficking network. He'd been arrested by local police and was awaiting extradition to the United States. Of the other participants in the conspiracy, 3 were dead, 2 were in federal custody, and agents were still tracking down the rest. But it was the discovery of additional victims that haunted Ray Kowalski as he worked through the evidence. Margaret's files had contained partial information about dozens of other children, kids who had been transferred or aged out, but had never actually left the system. They'd been sold to buyers whose identities were hidden behind layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Some of those children might still be alive, somewhere in the world, living under assumed names with people who had purchased them like property. Others had likely been killed when they became too much trouble or too old to be marketable. The 4 children found in the underground chamber, Sarah, David, Michael, and Jessica, had been the ones who fought back. Margaret's notes described them as resistors, children who had tried to organize the others, who had attempted to report the abuse, who had made themselves too dangerous to be sold. They'd been examples, Margaret believed. Killed to show the other children what happened to those who didn't cooperate. April 2, 2024. Location, Millfield County Cemetery. The memorial service for Sarah Martinez, David Park, Michael Torres, and Jessica Bloom was small but significant. Representatives from the FBI, local law enforcement, and child advocacy groups attended, along with a handful of family members who had never stopped looking for answers about their missing children. Sarah's mother, Rosa Martinez, had driven from Texas for the service. She'd spent 34 years wondering what had happened to her daughter, blaming herself for the circumstances that had led to Sarah being placed in foster care in the first place. "I knew something was wrong," she told Ray after the service. "When they told me Sarah had run away, I knew that wasn't true. Sarah wouldn't have run. She would have come home to me, no matter what." David Park's adoptive father, William Park, had conducted his own investigation for years after David disappeared. He'd hired private investigators, pressured law enforcement, and even traveled to Ohio multiple times to search for answers. The system failed these children, he said, standing beside the small memorial marker that had been placed in the cemetery. But at least now we know the truth. At least now they can rest. Michael Torres had no family at the service. He'd been in state care since infancy, passed from one placement to another until he'd ended up at Meadowbrook. In the absence of relatives, one of the FBI agents read a statement about Michael's life, about his dreams of becoming a mechanic, about the drawings he'd made that were found among Margaret Chen's files. Jessica Bloom's grandmother, Patricia Bloom, was 91 years old and had to be helped to the memorial marker. She'd been fighting for custody of Jessica when the girl disappeared, trying to get her out of the system that had placed her in increasingly dangerous situations. She was just a baby, Patricia whispered, touching the memorial stone. Just a little girl who needed someone to protect her. The memorial marker was simple granite, engraved with 4 names and a single line. They deserved better. They will not be forgotten. April 15, 2024. Location: FBI Field Office, Cleveland. The investigation into the Meadowbrook trafficking network had expanded beyond anything Ray had anticipated when he first responded to the excavation site a month earlier. Federal agents working the case had identified connections to similar operations in 12 states, and Interpol was investigating international connections that reached into at least 6 countries. Margaret Chen's files had been the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had operated for nearly a decade, selling children to buyers who wanted no questions asked and no official oversight. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of children trafficked, dozens murdered, millions of dollars in profits funneled through complex financial networks. But it was the personal cost that stayed with Ray as he worked through the evidence. Every file told the story of a child who had been failed by the system meant to protect them. Kids like Sarah, David, Michael, and Jessica, who had been labeled as difficult or unadoptable and then disappeared entirely. Margaret Chen had tried to save them. In her 11 days at Meadowbrook, she'd gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire network, if she'd lived long enough to get that evidence to the FBI. Instead, she died trying to protect children she barely knew, and her files had remained hidden for 34 years. The investigation was ongoing. Eleanor Voss's extradition hearing was scheduled for next month. Dr. Carmichael was in federal custody awaiting trial. Dozens of other suspects were being tracked down by FBI agents across multiple states. But for Ray, the case would always come back to those 4 children found in the underground chamber and to Margaret Chen, who had died trying to save them. Justice, when it finally came, would be cold comfort for lives that had been cut short and families that had spent decades wondering what had happened to their children. June 10, 2024. Location: Federal Courthouse, Cleveland. Eleanor Voss was extradited to the United States on federal charges of child trafficking, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. At 78 years old, she appeared frail and confused in court, her lawyers arguing that she was mentally incompetent to stand trial. But FBI agent Karen Torres had reviewed hours of recorded phone calls Voss had made from her compound in Guatemala, conversations in which she discussed the Meadowbrook operation in detail with other suspects who were still being tracked down. The recordings revealed a woman who was sharp, calculating, and completely aware of what she had done. "She's not confused," Torres told Ray as they watched Voss being led away in handcuffs after her arraignment. "She's just finally been caught." The trial would take months to prepare, and Torres expected it to be one of the largest child trafficking cases in U.S. history. The evidence Margaret Chen had collected would be central to the prosecution's case, 34-year-old documents that painted a detailed picture of systematic abuse and murder. Dr. Raymond Carmichael had already pled guilty to federal trafficking charges in exchange for cooperation in the investigation. His testimony was expected to implicate dozens of other people in the network, including buyers who had purchased children and officials who had helped cover up the operation. But there were still questions that might never be answered. How many children had been sold? How many had been killed? How many might still be alive somewhere in the world, living under assumed names with their purchasers? Margaret Chen's files suggested the true scope of the operation was much larger than what investigators had uncovered so far. References to expansion operations in other states, to international buyers who required special handling, to disposal protocols for children who became too troublesome to sell. The investigation would continue for years, following leads across multiple continents, trying to identify victims and track down the people who had destroyed their lives for profit. But for the families of Sarah Martinez, David Park, Michael Torres, and Jessica Bloom, the investigation had already achieved its most important goal, giving them answers about what had happened to their children, and ensuring that those children would finally be remembered not as runaways or statistics, but as victims of one of the most systematic and brutal crimes in Ohio's history. In her final report on the case, FBI agent Torres wrote, "The Meadowbrook investigation serves as a reminder that the systems we create to protect our most vulnerable citizens can be corrupted by people who see opportunity in others' suffering." Margaret Chen died trying to expose that corruption, and her courage ultimately brought justice to children who had been forgotten by everyone except their families. The 4 children found in the underground chamber, Sarah, David, Michael, and Jessica, fought back against their abusers even when they knew it might cost them their lives. They deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as heroes who refused to cooperate with evil, even when cooperation might have saved them. Their story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken, even in the darkest circumstances. They will not be forgotten. The case files were sealed pending trial, but copies of Margaret Chen's handwritten notes were preserved in the FBI's archives, a record of one woman's desperate attempt to save children she barely knew, and of 4 teenagers who died rather than submit to the monsters who had bought and sold them like property. In the end, their courage had brought down an entire network of abuse, ensuring that no other children would suffer the same fate. It had taken 34 years, but justice had finally come to Meadowbrook.